What if you're hired by a company, but somewhere along the way, you find out that you weren't the first choice for the job? How do you react to that news? And how does the company or the employees react to either you knowing the news or them knowing it as well? Samir Nurmohamad is an associate professor of management here at the Wharton School, and he's part of research that looked into this component, and he joins us right now. Samir, great to talk to you again. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Dan.
I guess let's start with what was it that piqued your interest to look at this?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I have an interest in the topic of underdogs. And it's this very idea that, and we've actually talked about it before, this very idea that when you're not expected to succeed, what happens? A lot of prior research says you're not going to end up doing well. And what I've found in my work is that you can actually be motivated and perform better. So along these lines, I started thinking of other instances in organizations where people might perceive that they're the underdog. And one common context is a hiring context. You're hired for a role, but you weren't the first choice. So sometimes this is communicated directly to you. So like, for example, at Wharton, our students are sometimes on a wait list, for example, for either the school or for their employers. And sometimes it just happens more indirectly. And I wanted to find out, well, what are the implications of that? So I got a little bit curious and started studying it.
But you would think that once somebody does find out that they were a second choice, that it probably does throw some unique dynamics into the mix, especially if you're in an office setting.
Absolutely, right? I mean, it becomes very fascinating to see, especially depending on which side of the coin you're on. If you're the person who's hired as what I call the alternate choice, well, what happens? Are you more reluctant to talk to people, or are you very proactive because you want to make connections and build relationships and get, a lay of the land in the organization? But then on the flip side, as a coworker, as a leader, what happens, right? Do you start saying, well, I need to really help this person more to get them onboarded, or are you a little bit more distant from them because you're not sure if they're as qualified for the role as someone else that you might have liked during the process?
All
So it
right, so
definitely does create these dynamics.
so let's take through each one of these segments here. The employee, when they find out that they weren't the first choice, what's the most likely reaction, feeling, emotion that they feel?
Yeah, so what we found in our research, and this is a study I did with Zoe Schwingel-Sauer, who's a PhD student at Michigan, but a former undergrad here at the University of Pennsylvania. What we found is that people feel actually less socially integrated in their work groups. And this was kind of interesting because in some of my other research on underdogs, we found out that people are very motivated. They want to prove others wrong. But what we found in our research is that people feel like they're less integrated in the group. They feel like they belong less. And this makes them feel a little bit more distant from their coworkers. And this has implications for their proactivity, especially in the first days, first weeks on the job, in terms of whether they get feedback from others and whether they're proactive or not.
So, what about the employer? Because the dynamics of making sure that they have the best kind of working scenario, the
Yeah.
teamwork, all of these different components, it has to throw a variety of different challenges their way.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the things we were kind of curious about, how do organizations handle this? What happens? So as part of one of our studies, we tried to find out, well, how do employees find out or discover or perceive that they're the alternate choice? And we found out that this kind of happens in a variety of ways, but two key factors were the following. One was this either happens before they start their role, for example, the organization tells them in some way, or it happens after they start their role. And you can imagine that there's a different dynamic to each of those. If you find out before you start the role, well, at least you're finding out before you accept the offer, for example, right? And you
Right,
can
right,
prepare for it going in.
right.
If it happens after you start the role, it might hit you as more of a surprise. You might have not realized this. It might be more unexpected and it might catch you off guard, for example. So that was one key factor. Did it happen before you started or after you started? And then the other way is in terms of whether you're told it directly or indirectly, for example. So some people find out through things such as a wait list, like we talked about, or maybe they'll have a conversation with their manager, or they'll find out in the offering process that, hey, someone else had accepted this role, but then didn't take it.
Right.
So that's one way you find out, but sometimes it happens more indirectly, right? And maybe it's not even intended that you find out. So you might find out through gossip from others, or may accidentally come up in a subsequent hiring meeting when you're considering other candidates. It can even come across in strange ways. Someone says, we're considering this person. What if they don't take the offer? Oh, well, it worked great with Dan. Dan was a great choice, even though Dan wasn't our first choice for the role. And people have a laugh at it. And you're sitting there saying, wait, is that a compliment or not? So
Yeah, right.
it happens in these unique and interesting ways.
Does the leader or the manager, does the type of person or type of leader they are factor into how that integration really goes and works to the benefit of all?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was what really crucial to our not only our findings, but also the theory that we were developing. So in our studies, we were finding this consistent effect, this consistent pattern that employees who were the alternate choice, who were not the first choice for the role, felt less socially integrated and therefore seeked less feedback from others. And we saw that in a variety of contexts, for example. And one thing we were curious about is, well, if we're seeing this, is there anything the organization can do, and in particular that leaders can do? So that's one of the things we examined in our final study of the paper. We wanted to see what role do leaders play in this process? Can they kind of ameliorate some of these negative effects, for example? And what we were interested in was the idea of leader inclusion. This is the idea to which leaders convey to others that their input is valued, that they're seen and heard in the organizations. And in our last study, we investigated exactly this. We investigated whether leaders were more inclusive to the alternate choice of the first choice that was hired versus less inclusive to them. And we saw that that had an effect. So that when leaders ended up being more inclusive, the negative effects were weakened for the alternate choice. They didn't feel as likely to feel less socially integrated. They were likely to seek a little bit more feedback, but it didn't totally eliminate the effect. It wasn't enough in our study.
It sounds like as well that the component of social barriers that which you talk about in the research becomes that much more important as well, so that you're trying to mitigate some of these issues, whether they be, in a team meeting or the first couple of days that a new employee comes on board, or even as you said, maybe
Yeah.
even it's before that employee even shows up to kind of lay the groundwork.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in our study, we were looking at it and we were trying to be really explicit, have the leader say, I value your input, I welcome it, and so forth. But I think if you think about these in organizations, there are many more opportunities for leaders to do this, to convey this repeatedly, right? Because sometimes you might say it once and your employees don't hear you, or they don't necessarily recognize it or believe it, for example. So I think having consistent messaging is really important. Another thing that matters too is how are these employees introduced to their teams? Are they introduced as, just Samir and their background and what Samir likes, or are they actually introduced through a lens of worth and it goes beyond that? Are you saying more about the person's qualifications? And those attributes really matter in terms of how people form their first impressions of you.
Is there an importance as to how you go about that, whether that is kind of in the formal setting or kind of in an informal setting? I mean, it could be, around the water cooler or a Friday happy hour in comparison to bringing everybody into the office building, into the office, the meeting room.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it's both formal and informal, and it's not just saying it, it's also demonstrating it and showing it, right? So how can you can say that this person has really great ideas and they have this track record, but how are you behaving towards that employee in the first meeting? Are you incorporating that employee's ideas? Are you giving them feedback on how they can be better, for example, and are they refining it? And then are people seeing that you value and trust them? That's going to be really important for this process.
What do you think are the most important takeaways from doing this research?
Yeah, I think, one big takeaway is just recognizing that this is out there. We were struck by the literature that this is a phenomenon that happens in a variety of domains, not even just in the companies that our students go and work for, but you see this in acting. You see, for example, in The Godfather, we didn't know that Al Pacino wasn't necessarily the first choice to be Michael
That's right.
Corleone.
That's
Similarly,
right.
Satya Nadella, there were other leadership candidates considered at Microsoft at the time. So there have been some profile people that have been potential alternate choices. We'd have to ask them to really find out. But yeah, so establishing that this occurs and it's a status that people recognize, I think that's one. The second thing that I think is really important, that really stands out, is that it can be really hard to prevent this from happening, right? Like one solution would be, well, we just shouldn't tell people. We shouldn't tell them whether the alternate choice or not. We should keep a lid on that. But what we found in our research is that people have plenty of examples of this happening, and it's really hard to keep a lid on it. So it's not a matter of just telling people, don't tell people. I think that's going to be a really hard secret to keep, and it may not be the best one. The better way of addressing this is, well, how are we going to reveal this, right? And
Right.
how should we be talking about this? And should we be consistent and on the same page, for example? And then how can we help people be onboarded into the organization? And I think that's where that last part comes in is, people think they're alone when they're having these situations, that I'm the only person here who's been the alternate choice. But one of the things we found in our research is that many people have these experiences, and chances are there's someone on your team or organization who's had it and who's been quite successful. So sharing their stories, connecting people with those individuals as mentors, for example, can be really valuable, and letting people know that this doesn't get in the way of their performance or motivation or how they're seen. That this can be actually overcome, for example, is really important for companies to recognize.
Samir, great work. Thank you very much for your time today. All the best.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Dan.
You got it. Samir Nurmohamad, Associate Professor of Management here at the Wharton School.